Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. I'm joined today by Dr. Elizabeth Varon, and Dr. Varon is going to be with us today to discuss her new book, Appomattox, Victory, Defeat, and Freedom at the End of the Civil War, which is now out with Oxford University Press. So, Dr. Varon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the book. I'm a big fan of Civil War Monitor, so this is terrific.
Now, we're here to talk about Appomattox, and I think everyone has, to some degree, a vision in their head of this, a very iconic moment in American history, Lee and Grant in the parlor, if you will, and one well-dressed, the other speckled with mud. But you really take this iconic moment and really expand upon really the contested meanings behind this actual event. So I wonder if you could just start by giving us a little bit of a brief overview of the book itself.
Sure. I make an argument that Grant's act of magnanimity in that famous iconic moment was not transparent in meaning. As you said, the received wisdom, our commonly held image, is of this meeting as a moment of healing. And I argue that Grant's act of magnanimity is paradoxically a source both of consensus and of conflict. Of consensus in the sense that the magnanimity is embraced widely by Northerners and Southerners. Conflict in the sense that the very stakeholders have very different sort of meanings that they attach to the magnanimity, divergent, conflicting, irreconcilable meanings that they attach to that act of magnanimity. So the book begins with the armies, and particularly with Lee's and Grant's inner circles, the men who were privy to the sort of drama of counter-maneuver and maneuver that final campaign had been, privy to the exchange of letters between the two men to their calculations as they forged the terms. And I argue that within those armies, and indeed within those inner circles, two different interpretations of the surrender take shape, even in the last days of the campaign, and certainly on April 9 in its immediate aftermath. And the Union interpretation, in essence, Grant's interpretation, the interpretation of his men, the interpretation that will prevail among most Northerners, and although not all of them, and I'll come back to that, is that the Union victory is a victory of right over wrong, and that Grant's act of magnanimity is a source of moral authority and an emblem of moral superiority, that it represents the final vindication of the Union's way of war, of free labor society. The magnanimity has a purpose, and the purpose is to effect capitulation. Grant makes the calculation that if he's magnanimous, this is going to set the dominoes falling, the surrenders of the remaining armies, and he's correct about that. But means to the end of atonement and repentance. And Grant and the Union soldiers believed that the Confederates had a great deal to repent of and atone for. So magnanimity is a means to an end and an emblem of moral authority and of moral superiority. The Union troops believe that they have prevailed in these final battles, not because of the overwhelming numbers and resources of the Confederacy. This will be Lee's argument, of course, but because of their own skill and bravery. So again, the surrender represents a vindication for Grant and his men. The Confederates, led by Lee, elaborate a very different and utterly contrary interpretation. For them, the surrender marks the triumph of might over right. And it is brought about by the North's willingness to use brute force. Grant and his men had believed that Lee has no power to negotiate in those final moments. Grant has all the cards. In the Southern Confederate interpretation, Lee does have leverage, and he essentially extracts concessions from the North. He extracts a promise at the moment of the surrender that these honorable Confederate troops will not be treated dishonorably. He extracts the promise that there will be no punitive measures, and the recognition that his men have fought bravely. In Lee's mind, his men have nothing to atone for. There's no need for repentance. You can see, again, the sort of fundamental incompatibility of these interpretations. Both Lee and Grant and the men in their inner circles are angling at this moment for the moral high ground. And Grant's magnanimity in his eyes is the magnanimity of a victor whose victory was total, who had meted out punishment on the battlefield and who could now demand atonement. And Lee's interpretation, again, was that his men had nothing to atone for.
Now, this is obviously a very special moment, an iconic moment for those who study the Civil War. But what inspired you to tackle this subject? and to really expose it for what it truly was in the war's aftermath?
Well, I was asked some years ago, I think it was 2009, by the Library Company of Philadelphia, a wonderful archival institution, to participate in a commemoration of Juneteenth, that announcement of emancipation in Texas, June 19th, 1865. And I agreed to participate in the commemoration. I didn't know a great deal about Juneteenth. I thought it would be an excellent opportunity to educate myself about it. So in the course of reading about the end of slavery and the end of the war and the connection between the two things, and about Juneteenth, I kept running across references to Appomattox. To Appomattox as a Black Freedom Day, as a moment that was commemorated and marked by African Americans at the moment of the surrender and for decades afterwards, well into the 20th century, as a milestone on the road to true freedom and full citizenship, a turning point moment. And the crux of that Appomattox as a Freedom Day argument was the notion that emancipation couldn't really materialize and be fully experienced by slaves until Lee's army had given up the ghost, until the Confederacy was a dead letter. And it was the argument, too, that African Americans had nailed the sort of final nail in the coffin of slavery at Appomattox in their role as liberators. So slaves at Appomattox are among the liberated, but also among the liberators, as 7 regiments of United States colored troops are critical to that final campaign and block Lee's escape route to the South. And this becomes, in African American post-war discourse and race histories and sermons and a wide variety of sources, a great point of pride that Black soldiers had been present in this key Virginia theater, beating the flower of Southern manhood in this final battle. So Appomattox is a Freedom Day. This intrigued me. That story didn't accord with anything I had known about Appomattox. I had also been doing some work on Lee, particularly his decision to join the Confederacy in 1861, and I'd run across some post-war discussions of that moment, and so this project seemed like a way to kind of bring these interests together.
Now, you've mentioned Lee, you've mentioned Grant. These are men that signed the terms, and they each have their own perception of how this war has ended, but word does trickle down to their respective armies in the immediate aftermath, the moments after the war ends, essentially, at Appomattox. How did the men respond in the Union and Confederate armies to the news, to what they were hearing?
Men on the Union side rejoiced, obviously, and embraced this notion of the surrender as a triumph of right over wrong and as a vindication, and began to elaborate a counter-narrative to this overwhelming numbers and resources argument. Again, a narrative that emphasized the contingency of those final battles, the heroism of the Union troops, the need for sort of bravery and alacrity in catching Lee, who might have, slipped his trap one more time if the Union men hadn't behaved so bravely. They embraced the magnanimity, not because they believed the Confederates to be blameless, but because they believe, the Union soldiers do, that they have meted out punishment on the battlefield, and that Union victory should be understood to be that form of punishment, and that the way is now opened, in its essence, to disenthrall the Southern masses from the terrible ideas of their leadership class. A key to understanding all of this is the persistence of that sort of slave power conspiracy understanding of the South and the North. That is to say, that the Southern masses had been under the thrall of this oligarchy who had led them to the slaughter, manipulated them, and so on. Many Union men really believed this and believed that the Union's magnanimity could point the way towards an embrace on the part of these Southern masses of progress, moral and material progress, and they saw, again, magnanimity as a means to that end. On the Confederate side, Confederates embraced the sentiments of Lee's farewell address, again, the overwhelming numbers and resources interpretation of the war, that they have lost through no fault of their own, and certainly not because of the superiority of the Union Army. The Confederates are loath to concede that. They believe they've been beaten by men who are their inferiors in every way. And what struck me most about the Confederate reactions was the disbelief of Confederate soldiers, even those in Lee's army who watch the army disintegrate, who watch it wither away, who are starving and bereft of supplies. They get the news when the white flags go up, they are disbelieving, and Confederate civilians will react in the same way. And this was interesting to me. We have a lively debate in our field over the the centrality of Homefront dissent and disillusionment to Confederate defeat. And it's a great debate, and the historians who engage in it are also good, Gallagher, Freeling, McCurry, and et al., that I tend to be persuaded by the last book I read. I mean, there's a lot to be said about both the argument that we should emphasize the resiliency of Confederate nationalism, and the argument that we should recognize the weaknesses of it. So in my book, I certainly see evidence of Homefront disillusionment in the sense that desertion is a major drain on Lee's army in those last phases, and Confederates will observe, Lee included, that desertion is in part a response to suffering on the home front and calls to Confederate soldiers from their families. On the other hand, to me, the disbelief was surprising and more evidence of the resilience of Confederate nationalism, in the sense that the disbelief sprung from the hope that Lee could work one more miracle. And this hope persists even in the face of massive evidence that's highly unlikely. So I came away feeling that we have to throw this disbelief onto the scales as we measure the impact of these scholarly interpretations.
Now, you've alluded to the Southern home front, the Confederate home front, I should say, and kind of some of the reactions there. I wonder, how did Union home front individuals respond, again, as this trickle effect, as the word spreads from the McLean House to the armies and then gradually home? How do Northern civilians respond to what they're hearing coming out of Virginia?
Well, let me say just a few more words about the South and then transition, in the sense that a major sort of argument of this book, and it's an argument many people have made in many forms, and it's one that it's hard for us to assimilate, and I say that having experienced the difficulty of doing this. It's an argument that we should have to be careful about not equating the South and the Confederacy and the North with the Republican Party. We do it as a shorthand all the time, but of course it distorts a great deal. What I found is that the surrender terms are controversial, and the debates don't simply pit the Union against the Confederacy or the North against the South. They pit those in favor of a thoroughgoing transformation of the South after the war against those who are resistant to change. Those are the fault lines, and so you find Northerners and Southerners on both sides of that divide. So on the Southern side, most white Southern civilians, Confederates, embrace Lee's overwhelming numbers and resources interpretation of Confederate defeat, and indeed they are given to vastly inflating the size of the Federal Army and downsizing the size of the Confederate Army. The Southern papers will say there were 200,000 Yankees and 800,000 Confederates. Well, that's not quite right, but it's on some level understandable that they would seek solace and consolation in this notion. White Southern Unionists, however, not surprisingly, embrace Grant's interpretation of the end of the war as a vindication for free society and the Union. And of course, African Americans, as I've mentioned, believe that the war is a vindication on an entirely additional level, that it sort of vindicates the cause of human freedom. And again, African Americans will inscribe a sort of civil rights message into Grant's terms and see in them this sort of hope and promise of racial reconciliation. Now, on the Northern side, we again have divides. Part of what I'm trying to argue is that there's no moment at which Northerners en masse celebrate Union victory and Southerners en masse lament it. On the Northern side, we have a spectrum of opinion that includes radical abolitionists, Copperheads. Let me tell you about just those two ends of the spectrum as a way of getting at what I mean. So radical abolitionists embrace magnanimity, as do most Northerners, and this assertion goes a little bit against the grain in the sense that it was charged at the time, and this image has sort of persisted that radicals called for vengeance, that they were out to make Southerners pay and to sort of extract revenge. I found that radical abolitionists by and large embrace magnanimity again as a means to the end of capitulation and atonement, and in the following sense, and here I'm sort of paraphrasing Horace Greeley, people like Greeley said, let's not punish these people in a way that would make martyrs of them. What fitter fate for the likes of Lee and Davis than to have to live and to have to witness the social revolution that is coming, to have to live in the new world that we've created. That's the punishment. They should be punished by, as some Northern papers said, by peace and prosperity, all evidence that the Northern way, the way of free society, is better. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Copperheads, who are loath to concede to the Republicans that the Republicans have won some kind of mandate in this war. And so the Copperheads believe, essentially adopt lock, stock, and barrel Lee's interpretation of Confederate defeat. They do not believe that the victory is a sign of the sort of moral authority and moral superiority of Lincoln's administration and of the Republicans' waging of the war. Quite the contrary, the Copperheads hold Lee up as every bit the equal of Grant's. And repeat again and again the overwhelming numbers and resources interpretation of Confederate defeat, and hope, at least initially, that Grant's magnanimity will be a bulwark against change, and that in their eyes it represents a repudiation of all of the policies of the Lincoln administration, emancipation, and all the rest. So we see keen divisions in the North and in the South.
Now, within a week of Appomattox, obviously, we have the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I wonder if you might be able to touch on just a little bit the reaction to that event and kind of the fallout, if you will, from that in terms of the future of where things may go with the reunification of a nation.
Sure. Well, anyone who knows the literature as we do knows that the assassination quickly eclipses the surrender. At least one would draw that conclusion judging by the scholarship. There are bookshelves full of books on the assassination and relatively little about the surrender. And this I think is a mistake, because I argue that the surrender and the assassination are very, very intimately connected. So we know that John Wilkes Booth is in the audience when Lincoln gives this famous last speech in which he tentatively embraces the idea of limited African-American suffrage, and that Booth vows to make Lincoln pay for this. And we see Lincoln as a martyr to black civil rights, rightly so, in part because we know where this story is going. At the time of the surrender and its immediate aftermath, of course, Americans didn't yet know this. They believed Booth, Northerners did, believed that Booth had reacted to the surrender, that the surrender provoked the assassination, that Booth killed Lincoln because he was bitter about Confederate defeat and eager to steal away the fruits of the Union victory. And this was the light in which the assassination is interpreted in the North, as an effort to steal away the Union's victory. Lincoln is, in the minds of most Northerners, he will become a martyr to black civil rights, but he is, in the minds of most Northerners, a martyr to Union, first and foremost, in this moment. He had steered the Union, Walt Whitman's sort of famous poem, he'd steered the Union safely to the shore, and now at this moment, his victory is challenged and threatened by this assassin. Now, there's been an assumption, along with the notion that the assassination sort of eclipses the surrender, a notion that the calls for magnanimity are silenced and calls for vengeance now drown out this sort of spirit of magnanimity in the wake of the assassination. And certainly you do find Northerners who say, in reaction to Lincoln's assassination, many of them, we had been too lenient, maybe this is God's will, maybe Lincoln was going to be too merciful and Johnson will be tougher. This is one frame in which the assassination is interpreted. I found, however, that the kind of lines I described, the different interpretations by different stakeholders and the reasons for those interpretations that I laid out, that these persist after the assassination. That is to say, the idea that magnanimity confers moral authority and is an emblem of moral superiority, this persists. And there's a sort of call and response. Some Northerners indeed call for vengeance, but others answer and say, we can't stoop to their level. We can't betray the spirit of Lincoln's peace. It is Lincoln who had designed that policy of magnanimity to effect repentance and to bring change to the South. So I find that this commitment to mercy persists to a surprising degree. And we have to remember, after all, the John Fabian Witt book has reminded us of this, that however much Northerners rhetorically lash out against Confederates in the wake of the assassination, there are, in the end, no mass executions. Northerners don't have the heart and stomach for that. And that's in part, again, I come back to really the key point here analytically, and that's that what tempers Northern reactions ultimately to the assassination is this widespread belief that the Southern masses cannot be held accountable for the sins of the leadership, that the Southern masses need to be disenthralled, not punished further. And this is the calculation. That's a miscalculation in some respects and had been all along over the course of the war. But this is a sort of calculation in the minds of Northerners who try to preserve the policy of magnanimity. The other thing I found is that the assassination doesn't bring to an end this moment in which Northerners celebrate their victory. It's a dissonant moment. If we look at newspapers in the wake of the assassination, we see coverage of Lincoln's death next to reports of celebrations of Grant's victory. Northerners see these things as very closely intertwined.
One last character I'd like to touch on from the book, obviously Robert E. Lee, in the aftermath of the war and discussions of Appomattox and its ultimate legacy. I think for some people they may have this view of kind of Lee quietly riding off into the sunset. He dies not too long after, a few years, but being relatively quiet in the post-war period. But you certainly present a Robert E. Lee who very much is trying to fan the flames almost with some of the words that he says following Appomattox in an interview that he conducts. So I wondered if you could touch just a little bit on kind of Lee's role post-Appomattox.
Sure. I wouldn't use the words fanning the flames. I think what Lee is doing is far more subtle than that. So Lee certainly counsels Southerners to lay down their arms, and he technically observes the terms of his parole. And he has a reputation for having counseled Southerners to accept defeat. And I have found that Lee's sort of behavior in the post-war period is more complicated than that, and indeed in the sort of moment of the surrender. In Lee's exchange of letters with Grant, in his farewell address, in his meeting with Grant on horseback the day after the meeting at the McLean House, in which he asks that a printed parole pass be given to each of his troops, in an interview he does in late April with the New York Herald in the wake of the surrender, in testimony he gives before a congressional committee in February of 1866, in letters he quietly writes to influential Southern editors, Lee points the way towards the restoration of the South's power within the Union. He's not counseling Southerners to submit to the political will of the North. Quite the contrary. I argue that Lee's farewell address, again, overwhelming numbers and resources, this is a document that resonates with Southern soldiers and civilians because it is an effort to console them in their grief. And again, it's understandable that Lee would choose to do this. It's also a highly political document written by Lee and by his aide-de-camp Charles Marshall, who are very sophisticated, educated men. And they know that this will do ideological work, if you will, that by denigrating the Union's victory, as they do in the farewell address, they can deny the North the right to impose its political will on the South. And that is Lee's desire, to deny the North the right to impose its political will on the South. He understands that his own personal prestige is a great asset, that Southerners have to be careful and subtle in the way they do this. And for Lee, this sort of worldview is encapsulated by the word restoration. It's a word he uses in his exchange of letters with Grant. It's a word he uses repeatedly before that congressional committee. In Lee's mind, the war has been a grievous event with terrible effects that have to be undone. And restoration for him connotes the return to the halcyon days of the early republic, before the slavery controversies had attenuated the bonds of union, before they had alienated North from South. He invokes restoration again and again as what he believes to be the true purpose of the peace. And what restoration means is, in Lee's mind, is that the values represented by his army, not Grant's, by his army, the constancy and devotion of his army, those virtues have to be restored to national life. And the people who led his society, those men, the best men, particularly the young men in whose future he's very invested, young Southern men, they have to sort of return to positions of prominence in political life. So Lee imagines that a just peace will restore to the South the prosperity and influence of these halcyon days. And he says this very clearly in his post-war letters. Now, this stance is controversial. Lee is not viewed by Northerners as someone who is counseling resignation and submitting. Quite the contrary, many Northerners believe his farewell address is a slap in the face to the Union Army because it doesn't concede their courage and their bravery and their skill. and Lee is a very polarizing figure in the post-war North. Copperheads, as I said, tend to lionize him, but most other Northerners believe that he behaves poorly in the year after the war, and the most important of those is Grant. By May of 1866, Grant is saying in the press that he believes Lee is behaving badly, that Lee has been so grudging in his seeming submission that he's done a great deal of harm to the cause of the peace. And again, Grant had sort of hoped that at this moment in the McLean House, these two soldiers would sort of teach the world a lesson about how to accept victory and defeat gracefully. And Grant comes to be disappointed in Lee's behavior because Lee, though, again, technically observing the terms of his parole, has spoken to his followers in code in the year after the war. And this code word of restoration connotes the restoration of the South's political power.
It's a remarkably tight narrative and a tight volume, I should say, but there's so much to unpack here. So I guess if you could have a message to the reader, what's the big takeaway from Appomattox?
So I've mentioned one to sort of see this moment as a moment of contestation. This is the Appomattox terms are a touchstone for the debates over Reconstruction, and a particular piece of those terms, and I might have mentioned this in the context of Lee's comportment, but I'll mention it here. The terms, it says so on the parole passes of the Confederates, say, in essence, if they observe the laws in their communities, Southern soldiers will not be disturbed. And for Union men who agreed to those terms, the emphasis was on that first clause. Southern soldiers must now obey the new order. But for Confederates like Lee, the emphasis was on that second clause, that they will not be disturbed. And that those few words, that cluster of words, that clause becomes a source of great controversy, because the moment Republicans begin to speak about the prospect, for example, of black civil rights and enfranchisement, Confederates turn to them and say, but you promised we wouldn't be disturbed. And that disturbs us. So again, this is a way of saying that the main takeaway is that while magnanimity is embraced across the political spectrum, within the year after the war, the political rivals are turning to each other and saying, you have betrayed the true spirit of Appomattox. In the minds of Northerners, it's men like Johnson and Lee have betrayed its true spirit in their stoking of Southern defiance. In the minds of men like Lee, it's radical Republicans who have betrayed the true spirit of Appomattox by seeking to impose change. In a sense, you can boil the argument of the book down to the following observation, that Northerners say, in effect, we don't want to punish you any further, we want you to change. And the reaction of Confederates is, to demand change is to punish us. Those demands for change are punitive. And this is a core argument. I do want the book to underscore, again, the dangers of equating the South with the Confederacy. I've done a lot of work on Southern Unionism, so that's a kind of theme that's very, very important to me. I also want to sort of make the following observation. It's not something I talk about at great length in the book, but it's an observation about the sort of stakes of these claims of victory and defeat. So there was a tendency at the time, and there's a tendency in modern-day scholarship to use war as a metaphor, to describe the political combat of the antebellum period and the extra-legal violence of the antebellum period, political combat and extra-legal violence of the postbellum period as warfare. And I understand the work that metaphor does. But I want to sort of caution readers against pushing it too far in the following sense. I mean, we'll sometimes see this, Christiana as the first battle of the Civil War, or Colfax is the last battle of the Civil War, sort of long Civil War argument. I think there are dangers in pushing that too far. I believe that Appomattox effectively ends the Civil War, and that is how it was understood at the time. Yes, there's still armies in the field. Yes, there are surrenders to follow. But those remaining armies, those remaining surrenders, the fighting that happens in the wake of Appomattox cannot restore the hopes of Confederate independence. Those hopes die at Appomattox Court House, and this is the understanding of the vast majority of Northerners, of Unionists, and of Confederates. And I think that, for me, one of the most important finds of the book is the observation that no Americans are more invested in the idea that the war was won at Appomattox than African Americans, because they believe that they have proven something and earned something, and that victory should be irrevocable, and they will stake their claims to citizenship rights on that victory and on the role they played in it. So again, to speak about a long civil war or to use war as a metaphor, I think is to run the risk of losing sight of the high stakes of these claims of victory and defeat. An awful lot was riding in the minds of Northerners and Unionists and African Americans in particular on the argument that what had been won at Appomattox was irrevocable and should herald the dawn of a new era. And so one last sort of corollary point is that in a sense, I'm arguing against the idea that Appomattox is a moment of healing and it's transparent. I'm also arguing against the idea that Grant concedes too much at Appomattox and the lost cause mythology is born at that moment, and this sort of slow drift to so-called redemption begins then. In the sense that I really want to emphasize the strength and resilience and resonance of that counter-narrative to the Lee narrative, to the overwhelming numbers and resources argument. Northerners really coalesce around that counter-argument, an argument that the Union's victory is an emblem of its moral superiority and the result of the bravery and skill of Northern troops. And I believe that counter-argument persists, and that it should remind us not to imagine that the rise of the lost cause mythology is this kind of inexorable process or this wave that soon, before too long sweeps aside counter narratives. They persist in this African American counter narrative about Appomattox as a freedom day. As I began, this persists deep into the 20th century.
Well, Dr. Varon, it's been a privilege to have you on. Again, the book is Appomattox: Victory, Defeat, and Freedom at the End of the Civil War, out with Oxford University Press. I neglected to mention earlier, Dr. Varon's at University of Virginia, where she is the Langbourne M. Williams Professor of American History. I highly recommend this book. In fact, I recommend all of Dr. Varon's books for anyone who's had the opportunity and privilege to read books like Disunion, to read about Elizabeth Van Lew and We Mean to Be Counted. These are phenomenal books, and Dr. Varon is a wonderful writer. So if you haven't picked up any of her works, I suggest you do, because they're very informative, but I think most importantly, they're tremendously well written. So thank you so much for coming on. Very generous
plug, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we can have you back on again in the future discussing a future project.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you.